Hello, in this week's programme we look at computer security and crack the code on this disc and you could win £8,000 worth of prizes.
Join me for a look at some of the winning entries from last night's 1985 Computer Animation Film Festival.
For the home micro enthusiast, we look at upgrading from cassette to disc. Most home micros start out by using cassette for storing and loading programs. Well, cassette tapes are cheap and readily available. The trouble is they're very slow. You see, cassettes were never designed for storing computer data. They were originally intended for taping dictation. So cassettes are a compromise. And that's why more and more home micros are now being offered with discs, because apart from being faster, they offer all kinds of other facilities. Here's the very popular Amstrad, and this is the disk drive unit itself here, and inside, there's the disc. Now, discs come in other sizes than that. That's a 3-inch. Here we've got a 3.5. This is 5 1/4, and here you see why they're called floppy disks. And this one, an 8-inch, which nobody seems to use these days. So what do discs offer? Well, for one thing, every disc has a built-in catalogue or directory of all the programs stored on it. So all I need to do is type in *cat, and there we are. I get a complete list of all the programs on the disc. Now, you could do the same thing with a 60-minute tape, but of course it'll take you 60 minutes. Now then, that's the program I want. It's called Graphic, so I just type in load Graphic. I'm not the world's best typist, but that's all there is to it. It's ready to run. How does that work? Well, inside the sleeve is, logically enough, a disc. Now, if I get rid of that sleeve, the disc itself is organized into tracks going round and sectors radiating out. When I load a program from the disc, it starts spinning. There's a read-write head, which is actually part of the disk drive, which moves in to read the directory. Now, on this disk, the directory is stored on the edge, and there the head finds where the program is. That is, it finds the track and sector number of the start of the program. It then moves in and starts to load up. Well, it sounds complicated, but all you need to know is type in load, and the rest is done very, very quickly. But disk also gives other advantages too. For instance, you can delete files, you can copy them, rename them, all very, very simply. Well, so far, so good. We've seen how this particular micro uses this particular type of 5 1/4-inch disc. But like everything in this business, it's every man for himself. As we've seen, there are other sizes, but the problem is more subtle than that. You see, there are many different ways of using this same size disc. When you buy a disc, it's got no information on it. It's just like a blank sheet of paper. So the first thing you have to do is format those tracks and sectors onto it. Well, that's very much like ruling lines on the sheet of paper. How many lines? Well, that depends on your system. Many systems use 40 track, but obviously you'll get more information packed in if you use 80 track. Of course, if you can write on both sides of the disc, you'll get even more information in. But of course, that needs 2 heads, one underneath, so that'll cost you. Now, that's called a double-sided disc, which is not to be confused with double density. Double density means packing the data in tighter, writing in smaller print on that piece of paper, if you like. So, out of that little lot, which one do you choose? Well, as often as not, the choice is made for you. There's absolutely no point in buying an 80-track drive if all the commercial software you want to run is supplied on 40-track. So it's worth finding out what's the standard for your system. And just about every home micro there is lets you upgrade to disk. Even the Spectrum here, with its micro drives, has attracted floppy disk interfaces. This one here is called the Beta Plus, and it costs about £95. It hooks your Spectrum up to a disk drive, which itself will cost another £100 or so. Well, most games cassettes take about 4 or 5 minutes to load. In fact, that one over there, Attic Attack, is still loading. But with this disk interface, it's as quick as this. Just enter a few commands, press the enter button, and Bob's your uncle. Once you're hooked on the speed of discs, you'll never want to use cassettes again. And of course, what you'll then want to do is put all your cassettes onto disk. But that might not be so easy. You see, there are 2 main problems. The first is that all disk systems grab some memory for their own use, so your programs have less room to run in, and it might not be enough. The second problem is that a lot of your commercial software is copy protected, so unless you really know what you're doing, you're not going to be able to transfer it. You'll need to trade in all those old cassettes for disk versions, if they're available. Most software houses we've spoken to will make that swap for about half the price of the disk version. But that could prove expensive. And of course, if you've got a Spectrum, there won't be a disk version to swap to. The system we've got here gets around that problem by taking what's called a snapshot of the entire contents of memory and saving that onto disk. If I just press this button here, it saves everything. It dumps the entire memory, not just the screen, but the whole program. Now that's a very, very neat system, very easy to use. But software houses don't like it. They think it's a pirate's dream. Although, of course, making a single backup copy of your own software for your own use shouldn't cause any problems. None of the copy protection mechanisms that the software houses have come up with can defeat a system like that. Well, not this week, anyway.
The Advertising Standards Authority named the computer companies whose ads are not legal, decent, honest and truthful. BT and Mercury are told to stop squabbling and start connecting. And Britain does well in this year's Computer Graphics Film Festival. In a report just published, the Advertising Standards Authority has upheld complaints against 6 information technology companies. The companies which failed to meet the authority's code of legal, decent, honest and truthful advertising were Electron-Equipped Computer Systems, Owl Software, Raquel Vodafone, Sinclair Research, Solidist Technology, which had 3 complaints upheld against it, and software games company US Gold. High-tech communications company Mercury has won a small victory in its long-running struggle to compete with British Telecom. Professor Brian Carlsberg, Director General of the Office of Telecommunications Oftel, has ruled that by March the 30th next year, BT must allow Mercury to connect to the existing telephone network. This follows long drawn-out negotiations between the 2 companies after the signing of an initial agreement in 1982. Carlsberg stepped in because, in the words of the Oftel document, after a period which appears to the Director General to be reasonable for the purpose, BT has failed to enter into an agreement as required by Mercury. IBM released its third quarter results this week and reported a drop of 7% on earnings. The company blames a hesitation in orders for the new 3090 mainframe in the US and the fall on the value of the dollar. The figures are being seen as a further indication that the industry is still suffering from a slump. American chip manufacturer Intel has announced a new microprocessor which could produce a new generation of micros, as Wendy Woods reports from California.
At a time when virtually all American semiconductor manufacturers are suffering through their worst year in history, some good news has appeared this week from Intel. Intel introduced a 32-bit microprocessor twice as powerful as the chip that drives the IBM PC. The 80386 can access 4 billion bits of information and will be the brains of the next generation of micros. This is Wendy Woods reporting for Micro Live in Silicon Valley.
And finally, here's some good news. Britain won 3 of the 8 categories in last night's Computer Animation Film Festival in London. British entries took the top award in the commercials, TV graphics and the pop promo sections. I was there, and later in the programme I'll be showing you some of the films you just won't believe.
Army communications in the field need to be mobile. Obviously, they have to keep up with movements in the battlefield. A signals convoy like this one can act as a relay post between units at different positions. We're on the move now to make sure that when they get to their site, there's a decent communications link set up, ready and waiting for them. This vehicle has on board a transmitter which will form part of a widespread communications network, and it's got to be installed and online as soon as possible. The crucial thing is to make sure that the signal sent from the top of this aerial can be picked up by headquarters, which might be anything up to 20 miles away. The problem is compounded by any hills in the way which might interfere with the signal. You've got to be sure you'll get a satisfactory reception before you set up the communications post. So I went to ask Yeoman of Signals Palmer how this is normally calculated.
I've got to do what we call a path profile, where I've actually got to draw a graph of the terrain between where we are and where we are working to.
A sort of cross-section through the earth?
Yes.
How'd you do that?
Well, what we have to actually do is look at the contour lines on the map and actually plot the height of each contour line for the whole shot.
There are dozens of them.
Absolutely.
How long is that going to take?
Well, this particular bit will probably take me 15 minutes at least to do.
Right. Oh, well, let's assume you've done that. I mean, what do you do next?
Then I've got to transfer to a proper drawing on special paper so that we can actually look at it.
I see. What does that look like?
Well, when it's finished, it will look something like this. As I said, we've used special paper, and this is where we are now. This is where we are transmitting to. And this is the actual radio line of sight between the transmitter and the receiver. And as you can see, it cuts through this peak here, which will be an obstruction, and therefore will cause the signal to suffer.
Now, so far you've only drawn, you haven't done any computation. What do you do now with that?
Well, once I've got this, I now have to go to a book of what we call nonograms and work out various losses, such as for free space and reflection. We work it out from this particular nonogram here and tell us roughly how many dB losses we're going to suffer.
Obviously a very lengthy, painstaking process. How long did it take?
Well, this has taken about 45 minutes, but these are ideal conditions. Can you imagine in the middle of the night in a tent, pouring with rain? Rather difficult.
And then what happens if you find that it's not a suitable site?
Well, then we've got to pick another location and start all over again.
You should be well pleased. Surely a job tailor-made for a computer, especially if it can be preloaded with information about land contours. And this is the computer that the Army's found for the job. It's the Husky Hunter. It's very light, portable, but it's very, very tough. Tough enough to take a few knocks, which it would need to in the field. Despite its size, it's got enough memory here to hold all the geographical details for an area of, what, 2,000 square miles. It's not exactly an expert system. You need training to use it, but if I simply enter the coordinates of each end of the link, and a few other details such as mast height and the frequency, I can just let the computer get on with it. There's a few seconds delay. And here's that profile. There, of course, is the hill that could cause the problems. And there is the path of our signal. The computer can now get on with calculating the signal loss. And shortly it will come up with a number, which is the number of decibels loss on the signal. Now, I'm hoping that number will be less than 150. That's as much as we can cope with. 150 decibels means that the signal at this end is about 1,000 millionth of the signal we're transmitting. But that's enough to cope with. Here's the number, 133, and that's okay. It's all very well setting up an elaborate network of communication links, but if this were for real and not an exercise here in South Dorset, then simply communicating wouldn't be the aim. In wartime, communications must be intelligible to us, but unintelligible to the other side. A lot of radio telephone messages there. Now, the enemy's bound to pick it up.
Well, no. The telephone conversations themselves are not in analogue form as currently used on the British telephone system. In fact, the ptarmigan system is wholly digital, and that means as well as normal voice traffic, we have data and telegraph. Because it's in digital format, then the messages can be encrypted very easily. Consequently, subscriber's voice is changed from analogue to digital form at his telephone instrument. And thereafter, as it's routed through the system, it can be scrambled or encrypted before being passed along the transmission links.
What's the difference then between encryption and the old-time scrambling that you hear about?
There is very little difference except in terms of the quality of the security offered by a digital encryption system.
Why is that more secure?
Sorry.
Well, the Army are obviously not very keen to be drawn on that one.